Welcome to the Athletic FC podcast. I'm Adam Leventhal. Breaking news in the early hours of Tuesday morning, Nottingham Forest sacking head coach Nuno Espirito Santo, and they look set to replace him with former Tottenham boss Ange Postecoglou. So what is going on at the City Ground? Well, with me for this one is Tim Spiers, who covered Nuno's time at Wolves in depth and in detail and watched him go on to have great success with Nottingham Forest. He also covered Ange Postecoglou at Spurs. Matt Davies-Adams, as well familiar to everyone that listens to the Athletic FC, but also can give us a Forest fan's perspective. Let's start with you, Tim. So, Nuno out, Ange in. How does that make you feel?
It's one of those sort of very, very shocking, but also not shocking developments. I guess you could see, the writing was on the wall for Nuno, I think, a few weeks ago when this very explosive sort of, argument behind the scenes with Edu and Marinakis became public. And then, we've seen huge issues with the sort of transfer window. And does Nuno want these players? Does he not? And a couple of poor results on the pitch. And so, some big name managers waiting in the wings. And it has sort of felt inevitable for some time. I think it's a real shame, that Forest were on their highest high for decades and heading into Europe. And, they've been waiting for this since the 90s. And for that to now be, who knows, Postecoglou may come in and just carry on that trajectory and do something really special. But it's just, I guess it must be a bit of a punch in the stomach for Forest fans who've got used to these wonderful times in the past sort of 2-3 years and are now maybe fearing that this is a sort of a fork in the road to go back to what they were used to in terms of the sort of chaos and madness that they have been used to under Marinakis for so long. So it's very hard to call which way it's going to go from this point, but it's certainly sad that it's come to this.
Matt, do you feel winded?
No, I think I did. I was at the West Ham game a couple of weeks ago, and from that point, I knew that this was coming at some point in the near future. I'm actually pretty pleased that it's been done this swiftly. I think there would have been a temptation to drag it out for a couple more weeks, maybe until the next international break, and I don't think that would have served anybody. I think it's probably quite a smart time to do it, because Forest are at Arsenal on Saturday. Nobody will expect them to get anything from that game. But after that, they play Burnley and Sunderland, and that looks like a decent opportunity for, if it is Ange Postecoglou or whoever the new manager is, to hit the ground running and put some wins on the board relatively early on in their tenure. It wasn't feasible to carry on with Nuno, and it's looked that way since that pre-Crystal Palace press conference, to be honest. So Forest supporters have had a lot of time to get used to this. It's sad that the person who led us into Europe for the first time in 30 years won't get even the first match in the Europa League in charge. But I don't think we can say that he's not culpable, at least in part, for what's happened here. And at least he leaves with his reputation intact, not only amongst Forest supporters, but as a manager. The next job that he gets will be a good one based on what he's done at Forest. So if I'm being optimistic, I can say that there's a scenario here in which Forest win and Nuno wins as well.
Tim, was it always the case that when he took on Marinakis, that there was only ever going to be one winner? Because there was a glimmer of hope that they might in some way, shape or form have repaired relations after that initial interview, wasn't there?
I remember saying on the Athletic pod a couple of weeks ago that they probably weren't the kind of men who would sit down and have a cup of tea and iron out their differences, that press conference, it was just on the eve of the season when you kind of, like Matt says, you knew this was coming. Nuno's very guarded and very deliberate with what he says and usually toes the party line. To hear him talk that way, he thinks so studiously about what he's going to say to the press. So it was clear then that something was very wrong. And he will have seen this sacking coming, by the way. This won't be a surprise to him either. I think he'll have seen it coming at that time. He's worked in environments like this before. Especially at Valencia, a kind of, sort of a turbulent sort of behind-the-scenes environment. So those comments he made a few weeks ago were a power move. It was about protecting his reputation, knowing that Marinakis was not going to fire Edu, and that if Nuno and Edu's relationship was completely untenable, which it seems it was, then it would be Nuno who would lose his job. If he was desperate to stay, Nuno, which I don't think he was, I think the only way at that point, amid a power struggle, is to be unsackable. And you only do that by doing what your owner wants. And he certainly hasn't done that if he's the man who's left Amari Hutchinson out of his Europa League squad, for example. And also, you've got to pretty much win every match. And like Matt, I was at that West Ham game, and they were desperately poor that day. At worst I've seen them under Nuno. And he looked clueless as to how to fix it in that moment. They had one shot in the first half. His subs didn't work. He had no explanation after the match, which was not like him. He said it was shocking. And the signs were also there. And I think I'm right in saying he only started one of his new signings that day, Dan and Doy. And 2 days later, he ends the window with 13 new signings, many of whom he probably doesn't want. So when you look at all that context, yes, this was inevitable. And yes, it is a mess.
Yeah, and Matt, on the issue of transfers, because obviously that was the demand from him, or the impression that he was giving, that the squad had been underprepared at the moment that he discussed it publicly. But then the signings do arrive. Do you think that he had a point at that time, or do you think it was less about the actual nuts and bolts of the players that he had in there, and it was more just a personal battle that he was having with Edu?
Yeah, I think it's the latter, to be honest, Adam. I mean, Nuno's always been very clear that he considers pre-season to be the most important part of any season. And that was massively successful for Forest last year because they were able to get Nikola Milenkovic and Elliot Anderson in to go on their pre-season tour. And he felt that was key. This time round, he had Igor Jesus and Jair Cunha, and that was about it for when they went away. Now, I think that there's got to be some acceptance on Forest supporters' part and on Nuno's part as well, that the reason that they couldn't get a load of players in early was partly because they didn't know which European competition they were going to be playing in, and the budget was going to be different, and the players that they could attract was going to be different between Europa League and Conference League. I think what has happened here, though, is that there are very clearly some players who are Edu recommendations, and the story is that they're players who are linked to Kia Jarabchin, like Amari Hutchinson, like Douglas Luiz, whereas Nuno was after Adama Traore and Mathias Fernandes for those kind of positions. Now, he hasn't got what he wanted. There's two arguments, isn't there? There's one where you say, well, you don't give a manager players that he doesn't want to work with. And the other says you don't give the manager carte blanche to make the signings for the club when it's likely that he's not going to be in position for as long as the sporting director or the owner is. So, yeah, the transfer business was confusing and confused. The Hutchinson one is particularly baffling, that he hasn't even made the Europa League squad. And that makes you wonder if that was ever a possibility, why was Nuno allowed to pick that Europa League squad? I think Marinakis has paid the price for trying to let this rift heal itself, or trying to let Nuno find a way out of the problem that he'd made for himself. And now it's got messy as a result of that.
Tim, back in the day, I used to cover Watford, who, sacked managers for fun. Regularly had seasons with three managers. That was almost like a quite a relaxed season at Watford. But in my recollections, it never really worked if you were sacking a manager this early into the season when all the preparation work had been done over the summer. You're almost handing a hot potato or a hospital pass to the guy that's coming in. Do you think that that's necessarily going to happen this time around, or do you think that that's a manager of the likes of Ange Postecoglou might be able to pick up the reins easily in this situation?
That's a really good question. I think the fact that potentially a lot of the 13 players that have come in were not wanted by Nuno or necessarily required by Nuno kind of helps the new manager, really. It won't help the new manager when it comes to the existing players who, I'm here and I'm sure have a great relationship with Nuno. He really prides himself on having those close relationships with individual key players in the squad, very sort of personable. So yeah, it's there's a lot going on at Forest. There are three right wingers. I think I'm right in saying, Matt, that they've signed for about £100 million in this window. They've got 3 senior strikers for one position. They've got 5 or 6, senior fullbacks. There's a real mix of young English talented players like McAtee and Morgan Gibbs-White and Hutchinson and Elliot Anderson, and then you've got four Brazilians from Botafogo, although one's gone back on loan already. And the large squad thing would have really irritated Nuno. I think, well, he's gone on record as saying it. That was another untenable part. It was a key principle of his success at Wolves, in that he kind of only had 16 or 17 senior players. Bearing in mind he's got 29 now at Forest. He sort of has 16 or 17, and that relies on a good injury record, by the way, which they had. But the idea being, and I know he carries these principles throughout his career, that if you have bad apples around the group who aren't playing and know they're not going to play, it's not conducive to team spirit. And he likes having that smaller squad because he believes it improves player performance in training. Everybody knows they're in the matchday squad. It's about pushing for the 11. It's not, if I train really well, I might not even make the bench. That's his preference. He said last week he wanted 22 to 23 players to get through 4 competitions until January, and he ends up with 29. So that would have caused big problems behind the scenes as well, I'm sure. You know, if Edu is just giving Nuno players he doesn't need or want, then again, it's another recipe for disaster. And that's where discussions with the new manager, be that Postecoglou or whoever, would have centred around, look, these are the players you've got, and this is the circumstances you've got to work with. And obviously Postecoglou or whoever will accept that and embrace that, rather than Nuno, who's completely anti that.
So we have obviously mentioned who is expected to come in at time of recording, and that is Ange Postecoglou. Let's get the latest from our football correspondent, David Ornstein.
Ange Postecoglou is, at the time of recording, on the verge of being confirmed as the new Nottingham Forest head coach. Overnight, we broke the news that Espirito Santo was given his marching orders. It wasn't his decision. He was relieved of his duties after 20 months as Forest boss, and Postecoglou was the first choice of Marinakis. Why Postecoglou? Well, Marinakis knows him. They both have Greek heritage, clearly a great fan of his managerial career, which has taken him all over the world at the City Group, and then Celtic, broke into the Premier League with Spurs. And despite what many people think of his overall time in North London, he ended their wait for a European trophy. Nottingham Forest will clearly hope that he repeats the trick in the same competition, the Europa League, on this occasion. And now he'll be in time for the Arsenal game, the lunchtime kickoff on Saturday. Coming with him will be a number of staff who worked under Postecoglou at Tottenham, his last job. Whatever you think of the job done by Espirito Santo, maybe Ange Postecoglou, with that European title under the belt, has now operated at a slightly higher level. And they'll believe that Postecoglou can take them on to the next level. And for him, it's a chance to get back into the big time. After his departure from Spurs, there were many links with him in the Premier League and abroad. Lots of clubs looking at him. Of course, Marinakis will not be an easy man to please, and that's the task of Postecoglou, the latest man to take on this mantle in a fascinating development among many at the City Ground.
So we've heard what David has said there, Matt. How does the prospect of Ange Postecoglou coming in make you feel?
Initially, it made me feel pretty concerned because of what happened with Spurs in the Premier League last season, but also because the style of football between Nuno Espirito Santo and Ange Postecoglou could hardly be more different. Now, my hope is that the fact that Forest have changed their squad so much in terms of the profile of players and the amount of new players over the summer, that this has been a consideration toward that. Certainly Nuno was talking about trying to change Forest's style of play anyway. I actually think that some of the players that Forest have got that they bought in and that were there already will quite like playing Ange Postecoglou football. I think Elliot Anderson and Morgan Gibbs-White are two that spring to mind. I think Murillo is going to have loads of fun. Whether Nikola Milenkovic is going to be quite mobile enough to be part of a line that high, I'm not so sure. But yeah, the problem that Postecoglou has got is that Spurs were absolutely atrocious in the Premier League last season, and that is a concern for Forest going forward. But he won the Europa League, and Evangelos Marinakis is desperate for Forest to do that this season, and I think that's a big part of the reason why he's been chosen as the successor. The other part, obviously, is that it's easy to get him because he's out of work. Now, I would have rather maybe waited a little or spent a little more and got somebody like a Marco Silva, who is somebody else that Marinakis has always admired, who's in the last year of his contract and has made lots of noises about not being particularly happy with Fulham's lack of business. But we just don't know, do we, with Postecoglou, whether he is going to be able to adapt his style of play to how Forest have been more traditionally, or whether he's still wedded to the way that he started the season with Spurs. But we ought to remember he did change it. That's how they won the Europa League final, right? They didn't play in the typical Postecoglou way. And you would hope that somebody as experienced as him learns from every job that they have, whether they go well or whether they go badly. And I don't think you can say it went completely badly at Spurs, because they haven't won anything since 2008 before he arrived. So cautious optimism with some concern.
It's an important point, isn't it, Tim, that we should remember that Ange Postecoglou was lampooned for almost this chaotic football, high press, we're just doing it this way and only this way. And it was almost as if when he was playing in the Europa League, he thought, I can go away. They're not going to be watching what I'm doing over there, but I have actually changed my ways and I have actually learned. And I know that I've had to adapt, because he has shown that he can change. And maybe he is actually going to be more of a fit than people think at Forest.
Maybe. It's fascinating to see how he's going to come in and and sort of, behave and sort of call what he's going to do, really, because for 18 months at Spurs, he talked about principles and how he would never, ever change those principles for anybody. And he only got away with it because he won the Europa League. I mean, he still got sacked anyway, but yeah, you can and should call that, clever, smart management. But I'm curious as to how he plays it at Forest. Is he this sort of principled manager who won't bend for anyone? I'd rather quit than change. I remember one game at Spurs, they lost 3-2 at Brighton. They were 2-0 up and lost 3-2. And he refused to substitute his players because he wanted them to endure and suffer and learn lessons rather than give them the easy way out of being subbed. He basically said, and I'm paraphrasing, I would rather lose that match with those players on the field and learn a lesson rather than earn a cheap 2-2 draw by sort of bringing on some subs to shore the defence up when they were going from 2-0 up to 3-2 down. That's crazy. Although you don't hear anyone else in the Premier League sort of say that. So to be that way, so far that way, to putting 10 men behind a ball in Europe to win a trophy, where do you go from that? It's really interesting. So yeah, the smaller club will suit him. I must say, I think a little bit less intensity. He did not handle
the what? Sorry,
sorry, I forgot I'm on with a fan here. Yeah, I think a little bit less scrutiny from the media, and I'm going to say it now, a considerably smaller club. But obviously, to be under Marinakis, that's another sort of explosive fit, really. So yeah, it is absolutely fascinating to see how he's going to get on.
Well, I mean, Forest finished 7th and Spurs finished 17th in the Premier League last season. Obviously, there's a couple of trophies with big ears in the Forest cabinet, which always give us that extra bit of clout. But no, I take the point more broadly. Tottenham obviously much more in this media spotlight, much bigger supporter base, much bigger stadium, etc. More scrutiny on them. But I mean, this guy's managed Celtic. That's not exactly a quiet job, is it? I think he knows how to work with fan bases. I mean, the Spurs, there wasn't huge cries for Spurs to sack him, as far as I can see. I think it was pretty divided, wasn't it? He brought them a trophy. I think Spurs supporters understood why they got rid of them, but a lot of them kept faith with him for as long as possible because they enjoyed the kind of football that he was playing, and they appreciated the fact that he was able to pivot in order to get them over the line to win the trophy. But he will definitely be given time by Forest supporters. I think there's no doubt about that. The whole atmosphere at Forest has changed markedly even since before Steve Cooper. There was a movement amongst Forest and a supporters group called Forza Garibaldi who kind of said, look, we've been out the Premier League for nearly a quarter of a century. Something's got to change. Maybe it's the way that we back the team. And that's something which has been massively beneficial to Steve Cooper, to Nuno, and will be to Postecoglou as well. So lots of Forest supporters have got lots of reservations, and legitimate ones, about Ange Postecoglou and the decision to remove Nuno. But you won't hear that the next time Forest play at the City Ground. All you'll hear is backing for the team and backing for the manager.
Well, I just wanted to bring in what Marinakis has said previously about Postecoglou. He said this when he was presenting him with an award in Greece in July. He said, "What I want to say about Ange is that he has spoken about Greece many times. He is proud to be Greek, and in the great success he had with Tottenham by winning the Europa League, he spoke about Greece." And he goes on to say, "A man who not only does not hide his origin, but is also proud of it. What he achieved, he did with a team that has not won any titles. It has had a very difficult time in recent years. In this huge success that the whole world saw, he promoted Greece." So, Tim, we know that Marinakis is going to be delighted to have a Greek manager. It's just going to be fascinating to see how long that bond can last.
Yeah, it is. I mean, those are the words of someone who has wanted to appoint this manager for a while, by the way. And obviously, this has been probably mooted for some time. The fact it's been lined up, pre Nuno sacking. I don't think you'll see what we saw with Nuno recently, and sort of going against the club, publicly. He strikes me as quite a loyal man who really sort of buys into and tries to figure out what a club means to its staff and its city. He really tries to tap into sort of what makes this club different or unique to others, and how can I buy into that, and how can I sort of get something going. And he really did that at Spurs, because it was different at Spurs. He absolutely transformed that dressing room, and this is going to be different at Forest. At Spurs, it was sort of post-Conte, if you remember, post-Stellini. They had 3 managers towards the end of that season. Kane left that summer. The Levy-out process has just started, and the whole place was directionless. And they were at a really, low ebb, and they needed that leadership. They were yearning for like an Ange type, a rabble-rousing, likeable at the time, because he did start off being liked, with nice press conferences, and a sort of a straight talker, positive attacking style. And fans just embraced that, and the madness and the high octane football and the last minute winners and the high line and the risks. And they wanted to have fun again. They bought into that to such an extent that when they lost 5-1 to Chelsea, they got standing ovation. But it's different circumstances here. Forest are just coming, from their highest point for decades. And Nuno was, okay, there are question marks over what he's done in the last few weeks from fans, but otherwise he was adored, I think, and they believed in him and they trusted him. But Postecoglou will need to earn that trust, because his reputation has been tarnished overall, I think, by what he did at Spurs. Despite the trophy in May, I think he comes out of what he did at Spurs with a less enhanced reputation. But what I would say on the flip side is that the players, I think, as Matt has alluded to earlier, the players will embrace this. Gibbs-White and Anderson and Hutchinson and others, they don't want 40% possession every game, which is what Forest averaged last year. I think only Everton and Ipswich averaged less possession than Forest. They want to be on the front foot and have lots of the ball. So I think there are quite a few players that embrace it, and I think that's why he'll probably get off to a good start like he did at Spurs. I think the players will enjoy the style of football he's going to presumably enlist.
Do you agree with that, Matt?
Yeah, I think so. I think, it's not like Forest flew across the line at the end of last season. They won 3 of the last 9 games in all competitions. They effectively blew up. There was a great chance for them to get Champions League football through the Premier League, which isn't going to come round this season and might not come round again. So I think that there was a fair bit of regret, actually, about the way things ended. And a lot of that was down to squad management. You had the likes of Olarena limping through the end of the season, literally. Lots of players completely cooked. Chris Wood, another. No replacement for him who could effectively come in. And so he had to keep playing even when it was clear that, his form had dipped because he wasn't fit enough anymore. So, there's obviously a concern, therefore, with Postecoglou, given the amount of injuries that Spurs had. But he's going to have a much deeper squad, I think, with Forest than he had at Spurs last season. There are 2, and in some cases 3 players for every position for him to work with. So I think he can get the balance right of mixing the team up a bit better than he did with Spurs, just because he's going to have more options. And as Tim says, there are players in the Forest team who want to get on the ball. Think about somebody like James McAtee. We've barely seen him so far for Forest. He feels like a really good Postecoglou fit for me. So obviously there are going to be players who will be really upset this morning. And one of the big things Nuno got right was making everybody feel part of it, or most everybody. You know, people like Jota Silva might have something to say about that. But certainly most people in terms of the playing staff were on board with Nuno and were big fans of his, and the feeling was mutual. But Postecoglou seems to foster those relationships really well as well. So you'd think that he'd be able to pick up the baton there. It's whether the sea change in playing style is going to be too much too soon without a pre-season to get everybody on board with that it might prove to be quite jarring for the players, and it might take a while for it to stick. But as I say, get Arsenal out of the way. Then you go to Swansea in the League Cup. You've got Burnley and Sunderland, next two Premier League games. There's a good opportunity there for him to have a look at various different players. You know, that Swansea game, I'm sure, will be a heavily rotated team. So get the chance to see players as to whether they can fit into his Premier League, Europa League plans, and get a couple of wins on the board in the league. Everybody on the playing staff starts buying into the new guy and his way of doing things, and it makes things a lot easier going forward.
The injury situation is going to be interesting, Tim, isn't it? Because for people who aren't necessarily au fait with what happened at Tottenham, there was a lot of injuries, and the accusation that was put towards him was it was his style of football that was causing a lot of those injuries. So there's going to be a lot of scrutiny on how that squad reacts to his new methods, because there's always going to be a new way of training when a new manager comes in, because they also want to make an imprint. It's often the case that the squad's not fit enough, or they can't do this, they can't do that, and I want to improve it. So that squad is going to have the screw turned on it in some way, shape, or form, isn't it?
Yeah, and those injuries constantly held him back at Spurs. I mean, it wasn't just sort of 4 or 5 players; it was sort of 10, 11, 12. You know, there were times you could name a full 11 that were sidelined through injuries, and these weren't, you know, broken ankles from an incident in a match. These were pulled hamstrings and calf strains and whatever. And you know, Van der Ven and Romero were out for a long time, and it did constantly hold him back. And he spoke about it and used that as an excuse and a reason, you know, to stick with him. Things will get better because when the injured players are back, you'll see exactly what we're made of. But that never really happened because they had a horrible tendency to bring players back, I think, too quickly, and didn't really blood them in reserve games and just stuck them straight into high octane, you know, front to back, constant running Premier League football. And lo and behold, the hamstrings would go again. So it was an issue. And again, this talks to the question of whether he's going to be adaptable or not. Is he going to change his style and his principles, which he talked about for 18 months? Are we going to get, you know, Postecoglou 2.0 in England? Are we going to have these months away from the game? Not too long a period, you have to say, but has the summer given him a different perspective? Has he got a bit of a tan? Is he going to come back sort of smiling and be nice with the media again, you know, like he was at the start at Spurs? Because the way, this is a minor point, but I think it really does annoy fans, the way that he was speaking in press conferences towards the end, the way that he was demeaning reporters for asking very straightforward, normal questions like, why did you lose that match? And he's like, well, isn't it obvious? You know, you can see that, can't you? Know, that kind of stuff. That's just horrible. It came across a little bit bullying, you know, to reporters. I don't like to see that. So hopefully he's had a bit of a refresh. And yeah, the key is the adaptability. And we've seen this, a lot of examples of this recently. You know, Maresca changes his spots and Chelsea win the Club World Cup with, you know, playing it long out from the back. Something he said he would drop Robert Sanchez for doing if he ever saw it doing him in a game. And lo and behold, there he's pinging 90-yarders up the field in the Club World Cup and they win it. You know, and then on the flip side, we see Amram not changing his formation at Man United and getting in trouble for it. You've got to be adaptable, and I'm sure that must be a lesson that Postecoglou has learned.
Matt, final word from you. Just a sentence. Your emotions. Are you excited? Is it trepidation? Are you used to it as a Forest fan with Marinakis in charge?
Yeah, I mean, one normal day of Nottingham Forest, etc., would probably be one sentence to sum it up. But Forest were outside of the Premier League for 23 years, and we're now talking about, oh no, we've lost a manager, and we're going to get another one in who's just won the Europa League ahead of our first European campaign in 30 years. So there needs to be a massive dollop of perspective on this. Forest have been in far worse positions than this, far more very, very recently. Less than 5 years ago, struggling at the bottom of the Championship, looking like they're about to go back to League One. So there needs to be some perspective that Forest are in the best position that they've been maybe in my lifetime, certainly not far off. They've certainly got the best squad that they've had in the best part of half a century. So whoever comes in has got some great players to work with. The owner is a unique case in and of himself, but you can't doubt his commitment to the club just purely based on the amount of money that he's put in. I think he tried to stick with Nuno for as long as possible, but it wasn't tenable. Would Postecoglou have been my first choice? No, he wouldn't. Is he going to get the backing from me and other Forest supporters? Does he have a decent CV? Yes. So let's roll with it. And, if it doesn't work, there'll be another one along pretty quickly anyway.
Matt, thank you very much indeed. Thanks to Tim as well. Whatever happens, it's going to be an interesting ride, as it always is at Nottingham Forest. Thank you very much for watching. Don't forget to like the video, leave us a comment with your thoughts on this situation, and we will catch you next time.
For more from the Athletic FC podcast, make sure you like and subscribe to the channel. We've got top journalists like David Ornstein, Matt Slater, Adam Crafton, Carl Anker, and plenty more through the entire season. Make sure you don't miss an episode of the Athletic FC. You can get it wherever you get your podcasts from.